For many decades, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, has placed itself as the absolute authority over people's lives and beliefs in China. Its officials have amassed enormous wealth through nefarious means. It has torn apart generations of Chinese families, and it demands that Chinese people worship it with an almost religious fervor. And yet, the CCP calls us, the Falun Gong community, which is a traditional Buddhist-based meditation practice that's free to learn and you can do in the privacy of your own home. They call us a cult. How did the CCP come up with this label, and what has been the impact on people's lives? We're going to take a close look at these questions. My name is Levi Browdy. I live in New York with my wife and 2 sons, and for the past 20 years, I've served as the executive director for the Falun Dafa Information Center, which is an all-volunteer organization working to expose the human rights abuses in China. Throughout this time, one of the big challenges we have faced is a constant barrage of propaganda from the Chinese regime. Their goal has been to divert attention away from the human rights abuses by marginalizing and demonizing people who practice Falun Gong. A cornerstone of that propaganda has been to convince the world that Falun Gong is a cult. And while this is a bizarre and tragic tale of a deadly campaign in China, it is also a campaign that has taken root, to some extent, right here in the West. In fact, we can feel the effects of this propaganda bearing down on our lives, our freedoms, our empathy, and even our ability to know the truth. It's that far-reaching. Let me explain. Falun Gong is a Buddhist-based meditation practice with roots in traditional Chinese culture. It was first introduced to the public in 1992. Over the next several years, Falun Gong grew in popularity, and by 1998, as many as 100 million people were practicing. During these years, the Chinese government leaders praised Falun Gong for its health benefits and moral teachings. But everything changed in 1999. The top CCP leader, whose name is Jiang Zemin, grew fearful that Falun Gong had grown too big and that its great reputation was overshadowing his own legacy. Therefore, in July of 1999, he ordered that Falun Gong be eliminated. Immediately, people who practiced Falun Gong were rounded up by the hundreds of thousands. Many were imprisoned, tortured, or killed. And yet, when the international community condemned the Chinese government and demanded to know why they were doing this, CCP officials had no real answer. Here's an example. Days after the persecution started, a senior Chinese government official appeared on ABC's Nightline with Ted Koppel. When pressed by Mr. Koppel, the only excuse this official could come up with was that Falun Gong was obstructing traffic and disturbing social order. Hardly the kind of behavior that would warrant mass arrests and widespread torture. The international community was not buying it and put pressure on Beijing. Several months later, in October of 1999, for the very first time, the CCP labeled Falun Gong a cult. This timeline alone proves that even the CCP does not believe this label. Otherwise, they would have used it from the very beginning. And remember, the CCP spent almost a decade praising the health benefits of Falun Gong. Furthermore, when you look at Falun Gong teachings themselves and how they're put into practice, it is abundantly clear that Falun Gong is quite the opposite of a cult. The instructional books and videos to learn Falun Gong are free to download, and you can learn on your own. There's no organization to join, no membership, no hierarchy, and no fees. To be clear, this means anyone who'd like to practice may do so without spending a penny, in the privacy of your own home, and without requiring the help or approval of anyone else. It's also important to note that Falun Gong teachings emphasize setting aside anger, resentment, and other negative emotions, and to engage life and those around you with honesty, compassion, and tolerance. Its teachings specifically discourage many religious trappings, such as worshiping, proselytizing, isolating from society, etc. The teachings encourage people to live their own lives, adopting the principles of the practice as they see fit. All this is abundantly clear to anyone who spends even a little time talking to Falun Gong practitioners and getting to know them. In fact, some journalists, academics, and human rights workers in the West who have done their homework on Falun Gong make it clear this label is false. For example, Ian Johnson, who won the Pulitzer Prize for covering Falun Gong in China and witnessed firsthand the cult narrative in state-run media there, said in response, quote, Falun Gong aimed at improving one's health and didn't meet many common definitions of a cult. Professor David Ownby, who is the director of the Center of East Asia Studies at the University of Montreal and did extensive research on the Falun Gong community, said the entire cult label was, quote, a red herring from the very beginning, cleverly exploited by the Chinese state to blunt the appeal of Falun Gong and the effectiveness of the group's activities outside China. The Washington Post laid it out very clearly when they wrote, quote, the crackdown against Falun Gong was undertaken to demonstrate and solidify the power of the Chinese leadership. This obviously is very personal for Zhang, the CCP leader I mentioned earlier. Another Post article went on to say it was Zhang who ordered that Falun Gong be labeled a cult and then demanded that a law be passed banning cults. In contrast, the nature of Falun Gong has been aptly captured by many leaders in the West who've actually come to know the Falun Gong community. Mark Palmer, a former U.S. ambassador and a co-founder of the National Endowment of Democracy, had this to say, quote, Falun Gong is, in my judgment, the single greatest spiritual movement in Asia today. There is nothing that begins to compare with it in courage and importance. Irwin Cotler, Canada's former Minister of Justice and Attorney General, put it this way, quote, Falun Gong represents the very best of Chinese culture and values. And did you know that the founder of Falun Gong, Mr. Li Hongzhi, is a 5-time Nobel Peace Prize nominee. He was nominated for the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought by the European Parliament. He is the recipient of Freedom House's International Religious Freedom Award and has received hundreds of awards and proclamations from local and federal government leaders across North America, Europe, and Asia. So clearly, this is a false label, and clearly the CCP purposely used it to divert attention away from human rights abuses. But has it really worked? What exactly has been the impact? Well, inside China, the results have been catastrophic and widespread. Keep in mind, in the 1990s, Falun Gong was widely respected. But over time, this propaganda turned millions of Chinese people into implements of CCP tyranny. It has turned police and prison guards into torturers of innocent people. It has turned neighbors and co-workers into CCP informants, pressured to identify people in their neighborhood or office who practice Falun Gong, so those people can be taken away to prisons and brainwashing centers. It has torn apart countless families. Wives or husbands, fearful of CCP thugs, threaten to divorce their spouses if they don't give up their practice. Children are ostracized at school or themselves punished if their family is known to practice Falun Gong. In short, this propaganda has dehumanized and demonized tens of millions of people, fueling atrocities throughout the country. Outside China, the cult label has had some effect in silencing voices in media and government that would otherwise stand up for Falun Gong. And when journalists in the West propagate these lies, and when we believe them, then the CCP, a foreign communist regime, has achieved something quite chilling. It has successfully manipulated our emotions, distorted the information that we use to assess the world around us, and in many ways, silenced us. So the next time you read in the news that Falun Gong is a cult, send the journalist a link to this video and ask him or her, does he or she know that they are repeating propaganda from the CCP that is not only demonstrably false, but is formulated specifically to vilify a persecuted group? Hopefully, they'll take a closer look and set the record straight.